13 minutes after 7 o'clock. Who will guard the guardians? Whose responsibility is it to make sure that those who sit at the apex of our political system are accountable to the very system over which they preside? Specifically, when a president faces serious questions, who decides what happens next? The law or the majority in Parliament? Well, on Friday at 10 o'clock, the Constitutional Court of South Africa will answer the question, not so much who stole the money, and certainly not the president's innocence or guilt around that, but specifically whether Parliament did its job or stopped accountability before it could even begin. Because in February 2020, we understand an estimated 580,000 US dollars was stolen from President Cyril Ramaphosa's Phala Phala farm in Limpopo. But it was never reported at a police station. Instead, it was handled from inside, from within the Presidential Protection Unit, outside of the normal policing processes. 2 years later, an independent panel led by a former Chief Justice, Justice Sandile Ngcobo, found prima facie evidence that the matter may involve constitutional breaches, but instead of investigating further, Parliament voted against adopting that report, and that effectively halted what should have been or could have been an impeachment inquiry. And that's what the Constitutional Court must decide on. Was that lawful or not? We've seen this movie before. In 2016, the Apex Court found that Parliament had invalidated its resolution. Well, it found that Parliament had not been able to hold the former President Jacob Zuma to account, and the court invalidated Parliament's resolution that cleared former President Jacob Zuma. Will it do so again? One of the parties that has wanted to see this matter to its full resolution is the African Transformation Movement, and its parliamentary leader, Vuyo Zungula, joins us now on the line from Cape Town. Always a pleasure to chat to you. Thank you for your time this morning.
Good morning, Bongani, and to all of your listeners.
We've seen this movie before. I said in my introduction, the Apex Court has ruled against Parliament, certainly when it failed to uphold, or at least to hold to account, the former President, Jacob Zuma. How do you think it might go this Friday?
Well, we're hoping that the Constitutional Court continues in terms of the principles and the precedents that it set. In 2017, December, it also issued another judgment. I think it was pertaining to the Nkandla report, where it found that Parliament had failed its constitutional obligation of oversight and holding executive accountable. Not only did it make that determination, but it also instructed Parliament to draft rules or processes in order to effect Section 89 of the Constitution, which, by the way, the process that followed in 2022, when we first knew about the Phala Phala scandal, the Section 89 process was basically the first time those rules that were in which the Constitutional Court said Parliament must draft those rules within 90 days. It was the first time those rules were actually utilized. So it's going to be interesting if the court either affirms the rules that it instructed Parliament to actually draft, or the court somewhat, backflips on, the rules that it said Parliament must draft in order to put in fact a Section 89 process.
Vuyo Zungula, this is obviously also a political matter. Is there any view in your point that accepts that the court might not backflip, as you say, but could accept Parliament's argument in terms of the process that it followed, that it could vote to either reject or accept the panel's report?
A Section 89 is basically a case of it's a legal issue. It's a case whereby Parliament needs to ascertain whether there were violations of the Constitution. Therefore, an impeachment must take place. It's different from a Section 102, a vote of no confidence, which is largely political. This one is more legal in the sense that there would be alleged violations. Hence, there was a setting up of an independent panel which comprises of only people coming from the legal field. You'll recall that independent panel had the retired judge, former chief justice, etc. And the report that they had to deliver was basically based on what the law requires, not on the political consideration.
Sure.
So,
The point I'm making, though, is Parliament is free either to vote to accept what a Section 89 panel report says or to reject it. Whether you buy the arguments made for either case is a separate matter, but Parliament isn't bound to accept a Section 89 report without voting on it. That's all I'm saying.
Parliament is bound by Section 43 of the Constitution in that it needs to conduct itself in a manner that gives life to the expression that it needs to scrutinize executive action. And when there is an independent panel report that has found that there is a case to answer, it's common cause that what would be rational for Parliament would to scrutinize, because that is what Section 43 of the Constitution says. Yes, Parliament does have the agency to decide yes or no, but that yes or no must be in line with what the Constitution requires. And the Constitution, in terms of this particular instance, Parliament is guided by Section 43 of the Constitution in that it is not about political consideration, it's not about anything. Parliament, therefore, needs to be judged whether did it fulfill its constitutional requirement. Yes, you have the power to decide, but your powers to decide are guided by the Constitution. And Section 43 of the Constitution tells you you need to scrutinize. Therefore, if there is an instance whereby an independent panel says there's a case to answer, the only rational thing to do would be to further scrutinize. So that is what we are arguing that Parliament failed to do.
So if Parliament had indeed accepted that panel report, regardless of any questions around the procedures that were followed, what would then, I imagine, should have happened would then have been an ad hoc committee, much like we have seen, to deal with the Mkhwanazi allegations. That's what would have then taken place to then lead to a possible impeachment. Would those have been the correct steps to follow?
Yes, definitely, because the independent panel is asking a question: is there sufficient evidence or prima facie evidence for Parliament to then continue a full-scale inquiry? And based on what was before them, they found that sufficient evidence does exist for then Parliament to proceed with an impeachment inquiry. An impeachment inquiry which did not or was not going to say either the president is guilty. The impeachment inquiry was either to say found that the president is either guilty or the president is not guilty. So it was not a case whereby the fact that there's sufficient evidence, that means the president is impeached. It only means that there's enough evidence to look into the matter. When you look into the matter, the final determination is whether the severity of it warrants impeachment or does not warrant impeachment. So the biggest issue that we faced in 2022, that even though the independent panel said there is sufficient evidence to look into the matter, Parliament decided not to look into the matter.
It's a long time since December 2022. The numbers and the dynamics within Parliament have changed significantly. Ultimately, though, is it a weakness of our system that a parliamentary majority can be used to shield a president from accountability?
Definitely. Fortunately, in this case, there is precedence in that the 2017 Nkandla judgment actually found that Parliament did abuse its majority. Like I stated earlier, yes, Parliament has got the powers to decide whatever that is before Parliament. However, the decisions of Parliament must be consistent with the Constitution. That's why we are in a constitutional democracy, whereby when Parliament is seen not to have acted in line with the Constitution, we run to court because we are of the view that the court is a final arbiter to make a determination whether Parliament acted in line with the Constitution or Parliament failed its constitutional obligations.
All right. If the court were to send this back to Parliament, what would Parliament need to do differently to restore its credibility?
If the court says that decision was irrational, then it follows that what then would need to happen is that the opposite decision would need to be taken by Parliament. The court does not need to say you need to vote yes for the report to be adopted, but it's very clear if the court says it was unlawful, it was irrational, then it's clear for all members of Parliament to understand that a rational decision means adopting the report, therefore to hold an inquiry. Hence, we keep emphasizing that an impeachment process is a legal process. Yes, it happens in a political platform, which is Parliament, but it is legal in nature. So all parties that are there, they are bound by the Constitution. We swear an oath to the Constitution. Even this GNU is premised on holding, the Constitution, to protect the Constitution and the rule of law. Therefore, one would expect that when it comes back to Parliament, then all parties must vote in line with what the Constitution requires, not what the political consideration of the GNU require.
But a political consideration for the president would be a very serious one if this were to be sent back to Parliament, because one of, it's understood, he's never confirmed it, but it's understood he was in fact ready to resign when that Section 89 panel issued its report, but we understand he was persuaded by members of his party and those close to him not to do so. Would a resignation by the president, should it come to that, would that then stop any further process as far as Parliament is concerned?
Nope, because even if a president resigns, an impeachment process needs to continue to ascertain whether there was wrongdoing, because once a president is impeached, then it means he can't have the benefits of being a president. For example, we've got former presidents, Kgalema Motlanthe, Thabo Mbeki, President Zuma. They all have access to, the state in terms of their salaries, the security, etc. Once a president is impeached, then it means he loses all of those benefits. So a resignation does not stop the process. Rather, a resignation firstly allows that now Parliament can proceed with the process without that undue suspicion that a sitting president who is under impeachment impeachment process may use his authority and power to manipulate the process, but it does not stop the process.
And to be clear, this has far more significant implications and resonance for our democracy at large in terms of what might occur in the future. This is not just about this specific president or any individual for that matter.
Yes. Look, in 2017, I'll always go back because the Zuma years as president, the level of litigation between Parliament and the constitutional with the Constitutional Court tested the role of Parliament when it comes to oversight, accountability, and the role of Parliament basically. Now, one of the things it found is that when it comes to the executive, particularly the president, there's a very high bar that is set for accountability purposes. Hence, you find that when the Constitutional Court found that Parliament failed its constitutional obligation on the Nkandla matter, it was basically saying, but the Constitution in Section 43 says scrutinize the actions of the executive, therefore you failed. Now, it becomes important that when the court makes a judgment on Friday, it must be about the principles, it must be about the office of the president and parliament, regardless who are the members of parliament, regardless who is the president, because the country should not be based on who is the personalities that are in office at the time, but rather the work that must be done by the institutions must always be based on the incumbents. They must always be based on the principle that have been set in terms of the offices.
All right, appreciate your time. African Transformation's parliamentary leader, Vuyo Zungula, speaking to us from Cape Town. To be clear, of course, even if this were to go back to Parliament and even if there was an impeachment process started, presidents have been known to survive impeachment votes here in South Africa. I'll take you back to April 2016. President Zuma survived an impeachment vote with 233 votes against that impeachment, with only 143 in favor. Zimbindab, Madoda.
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions.
Your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.